Hello, thank you for watching another video. I truly appreciate your participation in this session. And today what I'm going to do is share a lesson that I've created around the SIMPLE acronym. So I use the S and I chose a standard from Standard 4, comparing and contrasting themes across books. I've kept my individual students in mind, knowing that some of my students are having trouble still identifying important events, deciphering between what's important and what's not important in books. So they're not quite to identifying themes on their own, whereas some of my students are doing a super job of using incidents to identify the theme. And they are starting to compare and contrast themes across books. So I'll model this lesson and I'll do that for you in a minute, where how I'm modeling is I'm using the interactive think aloud, where I'm using my read aloud and I'm sharing my thinking. And I'm really letting my students know that as a reader, we are thinkers. And this is what's going on in my mind. I ask myself these types of questions, and that's how I make meaning. The the practice will be that my students will be expected to go off and read their independent reading books and practice the strategies that I share. And the L will be me looking around the room and figuring out, what are my students learning? Are they learning? Are they able to do what I've modeled independently, or do they still need help? Do they keep looking over at me or asking their neighbors what they should be doing? And that's part of the evaluation piece, where I might decide that today I'm going to move around and conference one-on-one with students, and I might touch base with many students and really talk for a few minutes with, say, 6 students during that time, and then I would go forward with my next lesson from there. So the idea would be that I would use my read aloud, and I always have a chapter book read aloud going on in my classroom, and I talk about that a little bit in the Google Documents, and I'd like to talk more about that in the future. And I am always reading aloud picture books to my students, and I'm rereading picture books, and I'm going back to the same picture books for different teaching points. So in today's lesson, I might have started with a read aloud, reading to my students for a bit of time, and then I might stop the read aloud, let them turn and talk, and then I might start my actual lesson. And so, for instance, today I might get to the point on page 77 in Charlotte's Web, and this is the chapter of the miracle. And I don't want to ruin the book for you, but this is where I'll read a little bit here, where it says, "On foggy mornings, Charlotte's Web was truly a thing of beauty. This morning each thin strand was decorated with dozens of tiny beads of water. The web glistened in the light and made a pattern of loveliness and mystery like a delicate veil. Even Lurvy, who wasn't particularly interested in beauty, noticed the web when he came with the pig's breakfast. He noted how clearly it showed up, and he noted how big and carefully built it was. And then he looked. He took another look, and he saw something that made him set his pail down. There in the center of the web, neatly woven in black letters, was a message. It said, 'Some pig!' Lurvy felt weak. He brushed his hand across his eyes and started to stare harder at Charlotte's Web. So, readers, at this point, I know that this is a huge piece of information that the writer here, E.B. White, has put inside of this story. And I'm thinking back to what we have read in the past several days, and I went back and I thought about important events that led up to what just occurred. And I remember back on page 48 in the chapter Bad News, when Fern was sitting and she was thinking about the fact that it came to light that Wilbur understood and was told that the reason why they are fattening him up is that they want to kill him. So it says here on page 49, "They're going to do what?" screamed Wilbur. Fern grew rigid on her stool. "Kill you, turn you into smoked bacon and ham," continued the old sheep. "Almost all young pigs get murdered by the farmers as soon as the real cold weather sets in. There's a regular conspiracy around here to kill you at Christmas time. Everybody is in the plot. Lurvy, Zuckerman, even John Arable. Mr. Arable, sobbed Wilbur, Fern's father. Readers, do you remember that point? That was when Wilbur found out he was going to be killed. That's why they were being so good to him and fed him so much. And then do you remember when we read where Charlotte and Wilbur were talking, and Charlotte here, Charlotte was naturally patient, it says. She knew from experience that if she waited long enough, a fly would come to her web, and she felt sure that if she thought long enough about Wilbur's problem, an idea would come to her mind. So this was a time when we see here that Charlotte is watching Wilbur learn that, so he is there and he's being treated so nicely, but the reason being is because they're going to sell him and use him for ham. And so Charlotte here, several pages later, do you remember when we read that she is trying to help Wilbur? She's trying to think. And when I read this, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, here was a problem. They learned something, and Charlotte, there are little pieces of evidence where she keeps showing that she is a good friend. And I would say a friend who is kind, because she's using her time to try and save and help Wilbur, which leads up to what we read today, readers, on page 77. And piecing together those events where Charlotte sees what's happening to Wilbur and she makes a plan, and then we learn today that she weaves in her web some pig. To me, when I read this, I'm thinking that E.B. White wants us to think about the theme of kindness. That's evidence, things that have occurred, events that have happened in the book. We piece them together, and the theme is kindness. And I showed you by going back, I actually showed you the evidence of my thinking by going back to things that had happened in the story that we've read about together. And something that we do as readers is, so I've used the different events, pieced them together, and identified this is an important theme of kindness in Charlotte's Web. And I started to think about, we've read several books this year that have the theme of kindness. Do you remember when we read A Chair for My Mother? And do you remember the huge incident that occurred when they got home? Remember we read that scene? And it said here, right outside our house stood two big fire engines. I could see lots of smoke. Tall orange flames came out of the roof. All the neighbors stood in a bunch across the street. Mama grabbed my hand and we ran. My Uncle Sandy saw us and ran to us. Mama yelled, "Where's Mother?" I yelled. "Where's Grandma?" My Aunt Ida waved and shouted, "She's here, she's here, she's here. Don't worry, it's okay." Grandma was all right. Our cat was safe too, though it took a while to find her. But everything else in our whole house was spoiled. Readers, do you remember when we read that? And then it went on to say what was left of the house was turned to charcoal. But then we got to these pages. And remember when we got to these pages, the tone of the book changed. There were incidents that were very sad that happened. But the friends helped. And it says here, the first day we moved in, the neighbors brought pizza and cake and ice cream, and they brought a lot of other things too. Then it goes on. Sally had made us red and white curtains. Mama's boss, Josephine, brought pots and pans, silverware, and dishes. My cousin even brought me her own stuffed bear. So this makes me think Charlotte's Web, A Chair for My Mother. Both of these books have things that happen, important events, and when I piece them together, to me the theme is kindness. My favorite line in this entire book, I think, is, so we know the fire occurs, and we then learn on these pages how their neighbors respond. And it says here, my cousin even brought me her own stuffed bear. Her cousin in A Chair for My Mother is just like Charlotte in Charlotte's Web. We see that these characters see these problems that have occurred and people are suffering and they do something about it. Here's another book that we've read this year, Fireflies. Do you remember in this book? Oh, I love this book. How it was so exciting, how he catches all the fireflies. But then we get to the page where we look here, and remember that page? Remember that picture, and it shows, and it says here, the light in the jar turned yellow like a flashlight left on too long. I tried to swallow, but something in my throat would not go down. And the light grew dimmer, green, like moon under water. I shut my eyes tight and put the pillow over my head. They were my fireflies. I caught them. They made moonlight in my jar, but the jar was nearly dark. And do you remember? Then what he does after he kept the fireflies captive, and he was so excited to have them, but then he didn't want to keep them anymore. I flung off the covers. I went to the window, opened the jar, and aimed it at the stars. Fly! The little boy set all the fireflies free. So in this book, it shows how excited he was. He caught the fireflies. He brought them home. He put them on his nightstand. But then he watched their light go away. And so he thought and he struggled with that problem. And he decided the right thing to do, let the fireflies go. Again, piecing together the events of the story, I see kindness with that little boy. Although he wanted to keep those fireflies, he knew that the kind and the right thing to do was to let them go. So readers, I want you to take a minute and I want you to turn and talk with your partner. I want you to think about Charlotte's Web and think about A Chair for My Mother and think about fireflies and just talk about what I just shared. And do you agree with me? Do you agree that those incidents bring up the theme of kindness? So at this point, I would let my students turn and talk, and I would eavesdrop and listen in. And it's a time for me to assess, did they get the lesson? Do I need to talk just a little bit more? It also shows too, if you notice my lesson, it was about 6 to 8 minutes long. I'm not quite sure, but about 6 to 8 minutes long. So it wasn't too long. And now it gives them a chance to talk and sort of, re-engage their brain. And then I can bring them back and talk to them again. And research has suggested to us that students usually can focus for about 2 minutes longer than their age. So 10-year-olds, that's 12 minutes tops. And that's actually a lot that I find nowadays. But my point being is, so they're turning and talking, and then I would bring them back. And at this point, I would say to my students, I would say, readers, I was listening to what you were saying, and I noticed how over here, these two readers here, they brought in other evidence in Charlotte's Web of evidence of the theme of kindness. And they also brought in other evidence in A Chair for My Mother, other things that occurred in the book that showed the theme of kindness. And I noticed too that they even brought back to another read aloud that we read of bringing the example of kindness when we read The Man for Clowns. Oh, I didn't say that title right, but they referred to that book. And they were saying, remember when these incidents happen, and that was kindness too, when they interacted with each other, the two characters. So today, readers, what I want you to do is I want you to go to your independent reading book, and I want you to be thinking about what does the author put in there, the incidents that occur, the important incidents. What is the author's true purpose of writing that story? Because we know that theme is the central idea. It's the huge central idea message that the author wants us to talk about. That's what makes reading so fun, is that we have these opportunities to think about things that are important and things that might affect us and things that affect the characters, the same type of thing. So as you're reading, identify the central idea. And we'll have another lesson that talks about there are several themes usually in books. But find an important theme today, several incidences, and then see if you can compare and contrast your theme with maybe Charlotte's Web. See if maybe you can think about other books that you've read that maybe have the same theme and similarities and yet differences. So good luck in your reading today. You know that your job is identifying a theme and then thinking about comparing and contrasting. Are there other books that you read with similar themes? And then maybe you're thinking about other books that you've read that have different themes. So this was a little bit longer of a video than I planned to show, but I wanted you to show that I use the simple here. So they're practicing, and then now is the learning stage, the L, where I'm moving around the room and I'm observing, I'm kid watching. I think the best teachers in the world are the best kid watchers, where they can read body language and see and whisper in and ask certain questions. At this point, I might ask a student, have you uncovered a theme in your book? Because maybe they have, and then they can show me evidence of how they know that's the theme. And maybe at that point I can ask, are they able to think of another book that had a similar theme or a different theme? And can we compare and contrast the different themes, and maybe how they help us as people in the world? Do these themes that we read about affect us, affect our behaviors? And I might move around to another student who I know is struggling with getting identifying those important events in their story. And so I might check in, make sure that they're reading a book that is on their just right level. I might check in and sort of scaffold and help them through thinking what is going on, what are the important events, and again, share my thinking. How do I figure out the theme? It's figuring out those important events, the central message that the author is trying to convey to us for us to talk about. So then the evaluation piece would be who has learned it, who hasn't learned it. And maybe it's that I bring them back together as a whole group and ask questions for a short period of time. Maybe it is that ask them to write on a little piece of paper. A theme that I came across in my story is this, and here are 3 incidents that happened in my story, and the page numbers, because it helps us to go back and refer. That I knew that this was the theme, and it made me think of this other book that we read that had a similar theme, or it made me think of this other book that I read that had a different theme, and I was comparing and contrasting those 2 themes. So I hope this helped, and please visit the Google Documents. So I emailed you just recently again, and all you have to do is open up that email and click into the Google Documents, and you'll see that I have written a companion to this video. So I've written my thinking behind, and please go ahead and jot down your thoughts and your questions. And thank you so much for watching this video. I know it was a long one. I'll try and work on making them shorter. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again for your participation. I truly, truly appreciate it.